Alright, in this video we want to continue talking about meiosis and mitosis and life cycles. We're going to show some little animations about this and some other ways of thinking about differences in life cycle between organisms. So we finished up the last video by pointing out that we had learned that most eukaryotes are usually haploid, with transient diploids formed by fusion and immediate meiosis or semi-immediate meiosis. And that meiosis is often stage-specific, that it's this peculiar, rare thing. Okay, so let's just depict this. So here we're back to our case where we have two different chromosomes. You can notice there's still different sizes, but now they're also different colors. And so what we're looking at here is, you can notice, a cell with two different chromosomes. Okay, so if this is a unicellular organism, then what that means is that this cell is a full organism, right? It has everything necessary for life. It can divide and it can travel away from cells that it divides from. It's not like a multicellular organism where all the cells stay together. Okay, so it can undergo mitosis to give rise to a pair of cells and more mitotic divisions. And again, these four cells now, they're independent beings and they can dissociate from each other. So after a bunch of meiosis, what we see is a large number of cells. And so then, under certain circumstances, two of these cells will fuse. Right? So we're accustomed to this with cells in eggs. So this is a similar thing, where we can have fusion of two cells to give rise to a diploid. And now we have two copies of each chromosome. Now, these cells will then undergo, they can also undergo diploid mitosis to give rise to more diploid cells. And then at some rate, these diploids can then decide to undergo meiosis. And now we're back to the haploid cell stage. So now we have a little picture of haploid to diploid, and then diploid back to haploid. And so in general, we can think about a eukaryotic life cycle, a life cycle for an organism, on this little sort of chart. And so what we have on the left is haploid cells, and then what we have on the right is diploid cells. And what I'm suggesting here, well, let's start to remind ourselves that we go back and forth from the left to the right stage, either by meiosis or by fusion. So let's take that one at a time. The way that we go from haploidy to diploidy is that two haploid cells, haploid plus haploid, fuses to give rise to a diploid cell. And the way that a haploid cell goes to a diploid cell is that the diploid cell undergoes meiosis to give rise to four haploid cells. All right, so that's basically the way we move back and forth here. So in the picture that we just went through, we had our haploid cells undergoing mitosis, then they fused to give rise to diploids, and then they underwent some mitosis, and then we showed one of them undergoing meiosis to give rise back to haploids. Or in humans, this would be, we're multicellular diploid organisms. Then some of those cells undergo meiosis to give rise to egg and sperm, and then egg and sperm fuse to get back to the diploid stage. Okay, so that's the top here then. We're just looking at the general depiction of haploid versus diploid. And then if we want to think about different eukaryotes and what their whole life cycle looks like, we can think about different possibilities. So basically, what happens in this haploid stage? So in the unicellular lineage that we were just talking about, we showed that these haploid cells can undergo mitosis to give rise to other individual haploid cells. Right? It's a unicellular stage that can divide and give rise to independent unicellular organisms. And we also showed that in our diploid stage, that our diploid cells could give rise to undergo mitosis to give rise to independent unicellular diploid organisms. So we could summarize our whole life cycle of the species, or the toy species that we showed there, as this: a haploid stage that undergoes mitosis, then at some rate fuses to give rise to diploids, to a unicellular diploid stage that can give rise to more unicellular diploid organisms by mitosis, which at some rate then undergo meiosis to get back to the haploid stage. So we could contrast that with humans. All right, so let's first go through a picture of humans, and then we can show how to represent that on our life stage diagram. Okay, so in humans, a diploid stage starts as a single diploid cell. This cell then undergoes mitosis, but in this case, unlike our unicellular case, these cells are going to stay associated, right? And they're going to differentiate to give rise to a multicellular organism. So we have many different stages of, many different rounds of mitosis to eventually give rise to our coyly smiling human. Right, so here's our diploid stage in humans. Now some subset of those cells in the germline are going to undergo meiosis to give rise to our haploid stage, to our eggs or our cells. And so now if we have two different organisms, two different humans, male and female, now we have eggs and sperm, and those eggs and sperm fuse, or an egg and a sperm fuses to give rise to a diploid. And now we're back to the beginning, right? Now we have our next generation of a single diploid cell. Okay, so that's familiar with the way that works, but now let's see how we can represent that on our eukaryotic life cycle. So let's start on the right. So we basically, in this case, now we want to say what happens in the diploid stage and what happens in the haploid stage. So now in the diploid stage, it does undergo mitosis, but instead of giving rise to many different unicellular organisms, this mitotic stage gives rise to a single multicellular diploid organism. So mitosis, but to give rise to a multicellular rather than to unicellulars. Well, what about in the haploid stage? As I mentioned before, and as you may or may not have learned before, sperm cells and egg cells, after they undergo meiosis, they do not undergo further mitoses. And so then basically what we mean is that this is a transient stage, right? So that the haploid stage here does not undergo further mitoses, but sort of immediately undergoes fusion. Once an egg or a sperm cell is created, the next cellular event is that they fuse to undergo a diploid. So we can summarize the human life cycle by saying the diploid stage is a multicellular stage, and the haploid stage is transient. It does not undergo mitosis. All right, let's practice another case. Here would be another way to look at this. So here we have a haploid cell, and here we have a diploid cell. And here we have a bunch of haploid cells, and here we have a bunch of diploid cells. So let's try to label what's going on this diagram. Okay, so this diploid cell gives rise to many diploid cells by what process? Okay, so here we're going from diploid to diploid, so that's just a copying mechanism. So then we want to label this part of the diagram with mitosis. All right, now a diploid cell gives rise to a haploid cell by what process? So I guess this could be a little confusing because we have many diploid cells and only one haploid cell. So in fact, here we mean one diploid cell gives rise to a few haploid cells by what process? Okay, so here we want to go with meiosis. Remember, that's the reductive one by which diploids give rise to haploids. How about this one? So here we have one haploid cell giving rise to many haploid cells. Well, again, this is a copying process, so this is mitosis. And then what's this process by which multiple haploid cells can give rise to a diploid? And that's the one that we haven't used yet, that's fusion. So we can represent the whole haploid-diploid life cycle in this way. A diploid cell that gives rise to more diploid cells, some of which then undergo meiosis, reduction to give rise to haploid cells, and then the haploid cells fuse to give, haploid cells undergo mitosis to give rise to more haploid cells, and then they can fuse to give rise to diploid. So another way that we could represent our different organisms on this kind of a form would be to just talk about how much of each one of these occurs. So for instance, in humans, there's a lot of mitosis, many rounds of mitosis during the diploid stage, so we could just make it a big mitosis. And remember, we learned that actually haploid cells do not undergo mitosis. So in that case, we would say that there's no mitosis in this stage. So on our general diagram there, we can depict our specific life cycle of humans in this way. A lot of mitosis, and then meiosis, no haploid mitosis, fusion of egg and cell and sperm, and back to diploids. Whereas the yeast that we discussed, we could represent like this. Yes, the diploids can undergo mitosis, but actually that's not the most common thing. They don't undergo much mitosis. And then we have meiosis to give rise to a haploid stage, which undergoes a lot of mitosis. A large lettering to indicate a lot of mitosis, and then fusion and around again. If we had some species that undergoes no mitosis in the diploid stage, then again we could just erase that. Okay, so let's have a moment to think about this. I suggest pausing it and thinking it through. Okay, so what happens, let's see which one or ones of these is correct. So what happens when haploid cells fuse? Well, when they fuse, they give rise to diploid cells, right? So A is not correct. What happens when haploid cells undergo mitosis? Do they give rise to haploid cells or to diploid cells? Well, we can cheat on this one by remembering that mitosis copies things. So if we start with a haploid cell, then we undergo mitosis. That's going to give us more haploid cells. So B is a good answer. Okay, so what happens when haploid cells undergo meiosis? Do they give rise to diploid cells? So maybe in some of you, something's going off in your brain now saying, wait, that can't be right. And you're right, that isn't right. Haploid cells do not undergo meiosis. Remember, meiosis is the way we reduce from 2 of each chromosome to 1 of each chromosome. So if you're already haploid, you already only have 1 copy of each chromosome. And so you can't undergo meiosis. Okay, what about haploid cells undergoing mitosis? Well, mitosis is copying, so if we start haploid, we should end up haploid. So D is not correct. And what about E? So haploid cells fuse. Does that make sense? Yep, we have seen haploid cells fuse. And in fact, that's the way they give rise to diploid cells. So in this case, either B or E would be a good answer. Haploid cells give rise to other haploid cells by mitosis, and haploid cells fuse to give rise to diploid cells. Okay, let's do another one. Give yourself a moment by pausing if you like. Okay, so now we're talking about things that diploid cells can do. Okay, so what happens if diploid cells fuse? Well, if they fuse, they aren't going to give rise to other diploid cells. So A would not be a good answer. What happens when diploid cells undergo mitosis? Well, mitosis is copying, so this should be more diploid cells, not haploid cells. So B is not a great answer. What about C? Okay, so when diploid cells undergo meiosis. Well, remember, when diploid cells undergo meiosis, they reduce their chromosomal complement. So they don't give rise to diploid cells, so C is not what we're looking for either. Well, what about D? So diploid cells undergo copying, then they're going to give rise to more diploid cells, so D is a good answer. And what about E? Well, diploid cells, remember, meiosis is reduction from diploidy to haploidy, so E would also be a correct answer. So in this case, either D or E would make sense. Oh, another way to ask this would be, haploid cells can undergo mitosis, meiosis, fusion, B and C, or A and C. Go ahead and pause if you'd like. Okay, well, let's think it through. Can haploid cells undergo mitosis? Yes, they can. They give rise to other haploid cells. Can they undergo meiosis? Well, they can't because they're already reduced. They can't reduce further. And can they undergo fusion? Yes, they do. That's the way we get diploid cells. And so here the answer we would be looking for would be A and C. Okay, what about diploid cells? So diploid cells, can they undergo mitosis? They most certainly can. Can they undergo meiosis? They can. That's the way we get haploid cells. And can they undergo fusion? Well, as we've discussed it, we do not see them undergoing fusion. And so the answer here would be A and B. Okay, so let's return to our eukaryotic life cycle. So we did a couple of examples of this. Right? In our first example, we talked about yeast, and we said the diploid stage can undergo unicellular mitosis to give rise to different diploid cells. I'm sorry, the haploid stage can undergo mitosis to give rise to different individual haploid unicellular organisms. And the diploid stage can also do that. It gives rise by mitosis to other unicellular diploid organisms. And we said that in humans it's quite different, that there's no mitosis. So here I mean by a single cell, that this cell does not copy, does not undergo mitosis. It stays a single cell. And that in the diploid stage there is mitosis to give rise to a diploid multicellular organism. And so in general, this would be our life stage, that we can think about a eukaryotic life cycle as having a haploid stage that's either non-mitotic, a single cell, or a unicellular stage, or a multicellular haploid stage, like the plant that we discussed. Similarly, every eukaryotic cell has a every eukaryotic species has a diploid stage, which could either be transient, that is no mitosis during the diploid stage, or it could be a unicellular mitotic diploid organism, or it could be a multicellular. So that's what I mean to depict with this. I think it's very useful for if with this diagram you can take a species and figure out what the haploid stage looks like and figure out what the diploid stage looks like, and you've got a pretty good picture of what's happening with the eukaryotic life cycle. Okay, so we went through this. So in humans, the haploid stage would be what? So we'd be looking here for A, it's a transient. And the diploid stage is what? Okay, so in this case it's a multicellular organism, so we would go with C. Okay, so what about this plant? Let's go back and remind ourselves from the last lecture. So here we said that there's a haploid stage that gives rise to a multicellular organism, and also a diploid stage that gives rise to a multicellular organism. So how could we represent this in our diagram? So let's start with the haploid stage. So what would our answer be here? Feel free to pause. Okay, so in this case, our haploid stage over here is a multicellular organism. So we would want to choose C to show that our haploid stage is multicellular. Okay, now what about our diploid stage? So that's our diploid cell that undergoes mitosis to give rise to a multicellular organism. So in this case, we'd want to also go with C. So we could summarize the life cycle of this plant, of this fern, in this way. Multicellular haploid, a multicellular diploid. Okay, so our take home from this is that diploid does not mean normal, haploid does not mean weird, in that it's the role of haploids and diploids are different in different species. The major distinction is that haploids have one set of chromosomes, and diploids have two sets of chromosomes, but more specifically, that they are the product of two different haploids that have fused. That meiosis is how a diploid gives rise to haploids, and that mitosis is simply a cell duplication. Thanks very much.